Good morning. Could you raise your hand? Do you swear or affirm the testimony about to give is the truth so help you God?
I do.
Okay, could you step up and have a seat? And then could you state your name for the record and spell your first and last name?
Sure. Nicholas Ejak, first name Nicholaas, last name Ejak, Ejak.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
In the year of 2021, where did you work?
Oxford High School.
Okay. And what role did you work there?
I was the Dean of Students.
Could you keep your voice nice and loud?
Sure. I was the Dean of Students.
Okay. And tell us, please, what does the Dean of Students do?
So the Dean of Students is primarily responsible for student code of conduct, so behavior and discipline, overseeing the attendance of the school, academic intervention, behavior intervention.
Okay. So Mr. Hopkins just testified, and he indicated he was a counselor, whereas you are the Dean of Students. So it would be fair to say that you handled discipline, whereas he handled the student advocacy?
Yes.
Okay. As of November of 2021, how long have you been in that role?
Just about 4 months.
Okay, so you were hired for that school year in the fall of 2021.
Correct.
Now that's part of administration, is that correct?
It's an extension of it, yes.
Okay. Was James Crumbley's son a student at Oxford High School in November of 2021?
Yes.
Prior to November of 2021, did you have any interaction with James Crumbley's son?
I did not know.
I want to direct your attention to what's been admitted as People's 201. This is an email from November the 29th, 2021, 9:32 a.m. And the email reads, "Good morning. I had a student during first hour, the defendant's son, who was on his phone looking at different bullets at the end of first hour today as I was walking around the room passing out their essays. I didn't get a chance to investigate it a bit further since it was the end of the hour. Now that he's on my radar, I'm also noticing that some of his previous work that he's completed from earlier in the year leans a bit toward the violent side. I can bring down these things later today during my 5th hour prep if you would like them." So you and Miss Pamela Fine were both on that email?
That is correct.
Okay, and tell us please, who's Pamela Fine?
So Ms. Fine is the restorative practices coordinator and the anti-bullying coordinator for the school district.
Okay, and tell us a little bit, if you know, what that role entails.
Sure. So restorative care and anti-bullying across the district, she would be working with students to restore situations between two different students, a student and a teacher. It deals a lot with behavior, and so it's more of like, how do you fix or repair the situation? And so she often would collaborate with me on student discipline, and then the anti-bullying programming for the district would be like mentoring kids together to prevent bullying and to report it, you know, when they see it, and it's more of a proactive approach.
Okay. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like you, Ms. Fine, and Mr. Hopkins have separate but sometimes separate roles, but sometimes they intersect.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Now, did you have any interaction with the defendant's son on November the 29th of 2021?
I did not know.
Okay, and tell me what happened after this email was received by you.
So it was received by me when I was in a meeting that morning. So I wasn't made aware of it until after there was a meeting that took place between Ms. Fine and Mr. Hopkins and the defendant's son.
Okay, so by the time that you had read this email, that situation had already been addressed by Ms. Fine and Mr. Hopkins?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you have any follow-up emails, conversations, or any other interaction regarding the defendant's son or with the defendant's son on Monday, November the 29th?
I did not know.
I'm going to direct your attention now to Tuesday, November the 30th, 2021. This is People's Exhibit 203. This is from a teacher in the school. Email sent Tuesday, November 30th, 2021, 9:32 a.m. It's addressed to you and Mr. Hopkins. Reads, "Here's the photo I took of his paper in case you need it." Signed, Becky. And there's an attachment. Did you receive this email?
Yes, I did.
Okay, tell us about your interactions with either students or administrators prior to receiving this email with regards to the defendant's son.
So I had received this email after I had alerted Mr. Hopkins to the worksheet because this teacher brought a photo of that to
Okay,
my
let me
office.
back up just a
Sure.
little bit. So before this email was received by you, did you have a conversation with a teacher regarding the defendant's son?
No, I did not.
Okay, so tell me how it is that you became aware of this math worksheet.
So the morning of November 30th, 2021,
Mhm.
I was in my office when Miss Morgan, who was the teacher that sent this email, came down to our front office looking for anybody that she could speak with about a student that had drawn some inappropriate
Okay.
things on a worksheet.
And you were there?
I was the only one available at the time, yes.
Okay, and tell me about that interaction, please.
So she entered the threshold of my office door and said she was just looking for somebody to report something, and so I had waved her into my office, and she had stated that there was a student that had drawn some inappropriate things on a worksheet, and then she proceeded to turn her phone around and show me a photo of the said worksheet.
Okay, so this is exhibit 130. Do you recognize this?
I do, yes.
And how do you recognize it?
That's the photo that was on her phone.
Okay. And so she turned her phone around and showed you this?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And tell me what happened next, please.
So I briefly read the statements and looked for a name in the corner and noticed that it was a name of the student that had been in the meeting with Mr. Hopkins and Miss Fine from the day before.
Okay, so you looked at the worksheet. What stood out to you when you first saw it?
The phrases that were written on there,
Specifically, which ones?
the thoughts won't stop, help me, the world is dead.
Okay. What happened next?
My response to her was, I need to get his counselor. And her response to me was she needed to return to class.
Okay, so she went back to class,
Yes,
and then what did you do?
I walked down to the counseling portion of our front office to alert Mr. Hopkins.
Okay. And tell us about the interaction you had with Mr. Hopkins.
Sure. So when I arrived to his office, before I even mentioned anything, he brought up the defendant's son in sort of a question form, and my response to him was, yes, how did you know? And then he proceeded to share with me that he had received an email that morning regarding that student, and thought that that's why I was there at his office. And then I had shared with him that I had just been shown a photo from Miss Morgan.
Okay.
And kind of explained what I had saw on the worksheet, and he immediately stood up from his desk and said, I'll go retrieve him from class.
Okay, so he received a different email the morning of November 30th than the picture
Yes.
that you were shown.
Yes.
Okay. Now, when you saw this picture, were you considering this in the realm of student discipline?
Not at all, no.
Okay,
I
so
was
you-
more concerned that there was a mental health concern.
Is
and
that
so-
why you decided to get his counselor involved?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So after you shared what you learned with Mr. Hopkins, he went and retrieved the student back to his office?
Yes.
Okay, and tell us what happened next, please.
So I waited in Mr. Hopkins' office for him to return with the student, and he came in and sat down and began to kind of talk through what was going on that led him to write those things on his worksheet and draw some characters on there. And the defendant's son repeatedly made sure that we were aware that he understood why we needed to do this and that it made sense and that he understood how bad it looked.
Okay. Did you lead that interaction with the defendant's son, or did Mr. Hopkins?
Mr. Hopkins did.
And why is that?
As the school counselor, therefore, looking into a potential mental health concern, that would be his responsibility.
Okay. Did your perspective, based upon the information that you were told, ever change from a mental health lens versus a discipline lens?
It did not, no.
So tell us what happened next after the defendant's son went through the drawing of Mr. Hopkins?
So he had sort of explained that he was interested in video games and that part of those the drawings on there were him trying to get into graphic design, which led into a little bit of a conversation about how there could be potential avenues during his time at Oxford High School to delve into that deeper with some other programs. And then he kind of leaned in more towards the statements that were written on there and talked about how those didn't necessarily explain the video game aspect. And then I listened to the defendant's son speak about him feeling sad lately,
Okay.
which in a high school is not that unusual.
Were you involved in the decision to contact the parents of the student?
I was there for it, but Mr. Hopkins had mentioned that we were going to reach out to his parents.
Okay. At some point, did you leave Mr. Hopkins' office?
Yes, that was after we were able to speak with a parent on the phone. And so I left to retrieve the students' belongings since our class periods had changed.
Okay. At that point in time, COVID protocols were still in place?
Yes,
Okay. Did students carry their backpacks with them?
yes,
So you retrieved the defendant's son's backpack from the class that he was in and brought it to Mr. Hopkins' office?
that is correct, yes.
Okay. And did the defendant's son stay with Mr. Hopkins until his parents arrived?
Yes.
All right. Were you there in Mr. Hopkins' office the entire time, or did you come back in?
No, I came back in once the parents had arrived for the meeting.
Now, what was your expectation of what was to happen that day after the meeting with the parents?
My understanding and expectation was that, based on the recommendation from the counselor, that the student would be leaving that day, based on prior experiences at schools where parents are called in to talk about student mental health. Typically, they leave when it's suggested that they leave.
With the student?
Yes.
You were there for the, how long, first of all, how long did the entire meeting last between James and Jennifer Crumbley and Mr. Hopkins and yourself?
I was there for 10 minutes of it, and it had there had been maybe 3 or 4 minutes prior to my arrival.
Okay.
I'm not sure if they waited for me to start or if they had already begun, but I know that I arrived a few minutes after they did, after I was alerted that they had arrived.
So were you there when Mr. Hopkins explained his concerns about the drawing?
Yes.
Okay. Now, he just testified, so I don't need you to go through everything he said, but do you recall if James Crumbley said anything?
During the meeting?
Yes.
He did. He expressed concern for his son, that he knew, or he reminded his son that he could always speak to him about stuff, and that he had a journal that he could write stuff in if he was feeling frustrated or going through something.
Now, as a dean of students, when are you permitted to search a student's personal belongings?
So when I have a reasonable suspicion that the student might have something illegal or something that's not allowed at school, and so there needs to be some sort of sign, like a report from somebody. Oftentimes kids will be seen with it, or they'll be showing whatever the things are that they've brought to school they're not supposed to. There needs to be some type of a suspicion or alert that I have that will allow me to do that. And
Okay.
so in this situation, there wasn't something that alerted me that indicated I needed to search.
Okay, and why not?
Nothing that he said, nothing that none of the behavior that he exhibited when I returned with his bag indicated that. There wasn't any suspicion that I had at the time that allowed me to believe that I needed to do that.
At any point were you informed about the defendant's son's access to weapons?
I was not, no.
Okay. Were you given details by either James or Jennifer Crumbley about the words and drawings on this exhibit? 130?
I was not, no.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning.
Good morning.
Prior to becoming the Dean of Students at Oxford High School, you worked in various schools and school districts. Is that correct?
Yes,
For most of your career, in fact, you worked with at-risk students.
yes,
Normally, that includes students with some sort of academic or behavioral problems.
yes, that is correct.
In fact, your role at Oxford High School, you testified today, primarily you dealt with the code of conduct,
Yes,
behavioral and academic intervention,
yes,
and issues with attendance.
yes,
You had not had contact with Mr. Crumbley's son until November 30th of 2021.
that's correct.
So, as far as you know, once you became employed by Oxford High School, there were no behavioral issues with Mr. Crumbley's son?
There was not.
No academic issues? No attendance issues?
No,
You learned on November 29th of 2021 that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone in class.
Yes, that is correct.
But once you had been made aware of it, or once you learned of it, you learned that that had already been handled by Mr. Hopkins and Ms. Fine. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So you didn't do anything else with anything that day?
No,
Okay.
I didn't need to do anything further based on the fact that Ms. Fine and Mr. Hopkins did everything that I would have done in that situation.
Okay. So you didn't see any need for additional discipline or any additional intervention or anything like that, correct?
That's correct.
On November 30th of 2021, you were advised by one of Mr. Crumbley's son's teachers that he was writing inappropriate statements on his on a math assignment.
Yes,
You were quickly shown a picture of the assignment on a cell phone, if you recall.
yes, that is
You
correct.
didn't look at it very well, correct?
No,
You saw that there were drawings,
yes,
but you didn't see necessarily what all the drawings were. Is that fair?
that's fair, yes.
You did see the words blood everywhere,
Yes,
but you didn't see much beyond that.
that's correct.
To you, the words on the page were more concerning than the drawings themselves, right?
I would agree with that, yes.
And that's because sometimes kids in high school draw violent things.
Absolutely, yes.
That's not abnormal.
It's not abnormal.
You felt that what was on the page here was not appropriate for school, is that correct?
Yep, I would agree with that.
But that it wasn't in and of itself concerning,
Yes,
and that you didn't see it as a threat to anybody.
that is correct.
You didn't see a correlation of violence with the drawings on the paper?
I did not know.
Again, Mr. Crumbley's son had no prior disciplinary history,
He did not know.
no prior bad behavior.
He did not.
He was a pretty average student.
He was, yes.
He'd only missed one class that year.
I can't speak to that.
You said you dealt with attendance, so that's why I was asking.
Yes, sure.
So you're not aware of his attendance
I'm not
history?
aware of specifically his attendance.
Okay. He had none of the typical early indicators that there would be an issue of concern other than these isolated incidents from November 29th and November 30th that you were aware of.
Judge, I'm just going to object to the form of the question. Typical indicators. This witness can testify regarding code of conduct and discipline, but that's it.
Yeah, unless he is able to testify about what a typical indicator would be, by his experience.
And I can ask him that, Your Honor. Based on your experience dealing and your education and training with at-risk students and for your position as the Dean of Students, there are what you would consider early indicators of potentially concerning or threatening behavior. Is that fair?
I would say that's a fair statement.
Some of those include prior disciplinary history,
Yes,
prior bad behavior by the student,
yes,
issues with grades,
yes,
issues with attendance.
yes.
Okay. So, knowing all of that, none of those, what I'm calling early indicators, were present other than the two incidents that you were aware of on November 29th and November 30th of 2021.
As far as I was aware, yes.
You sat in on the conversation between Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Crumbley's son on November 30th of 2021.
Yes, I did.
And that was before his Mr. Crumbley and his wife got to the school.
That's correct.
Based on the information that you had at that time, you did not believe that Mr. Crumbley's son posed a threat to anyone.
That's a fair statement, yes.
You were even less concerned after you confirmed some of the information that you'd learned from Mr. Crumbley's son with Mr. Crumbley's wife.
Yes, after she had confirmed all the information he shared with us, my concern from a discipline standpoint was pretty much lowered all the way to none at that point.
Okay. And you said all of the information that he had shared with you. And we've heard some about that, but I just want to confirm. That was about the losses that he'd experienced in 2021, correct? The loss of a family member,
Yes,
the loss of his family dog,
yes,
a friend had moved away,
yes.
he'd struggled with COVID,
He did, yes,
he had a hard time with virtual school.
yes.
Those were the things that you confirmed with his family, with his parents.
Along with his desire for graphic design and video games, and that they thought he should focus more on academics rather than that, which is what he had shared with us during the meeting.
Okay. When you say he had shared with us, are you referencing a discussion or an argument he had with his parents the night before that related to video game design and grades, or was this something separate?
Both. No, he had shared that he was interested in that and that he didn't feel his parents supported that, and that led to an argument the night before, but he didn't provide any context to that. at all, and they had confirmed that, but they also didn't provide any context to that either.
So there was a confirmation that the student and Mr. Crumbley's son and Mr. Crumbley and his wife had had an argument with their son the night before. It sounded to you like it may have related to video game design and grades, but you didn't have any context beyond what you believed it to be about.
That's correct, yes.
Now, obviously, during these meetings, you expect for a student's parents to give you information about things that they are concerned about, correct?
Typically in these meetings, parents come to them and they provide additional context, stuff they're seeing at home, a history of, if you know, especially in a mental health situation, a history of any kind of counseling, and any issues they've had at other schools or whatever, but they usually provide additional information.
So you said specifically things that they see at home, things that they're concerned about. Obviously, in order for a parent to see something at home or be concerned about it, they have to be aware of it. Is that fair?
Speculation too, Jen.
I don't know how a parent could be concerned if they're not aware of something.
The dean of students can't testify as to how a parent would be aware of something at home in a meeting, not even specific to what we're talking about here.
Actually, my question was different, Your Honor. My question was, he would expect that, or it's his belief that if a parent is concerned about something, then they're aware of it.
But then it's a lack of personal knowledge. Mr. Ejak was the dean of students in Oxford High School in November of 2021, in charge of discipline and code of conduct issues, Judge. Mr. Hopkins was the counselor. He's already testified.
Okay. I think are you asking him if the parents aren't aware of something, they're not aware of it?
Kind of, Your Honor. Obviously, and I can ask my question differently and see if it makes it a little more simple.
All right.
Mr. Ejak, based on your experience, your education and your training, and just your knowledge in general of you're a human being, if someone doesn't have knowledge of something, they can't talk about it. Is that fair? Does that make sense to you?
I would say that's a fair statement.
So we can't talk about things we don't know about. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Obviously, James Crumbley can't tell you about things he may not be aware of. I'm sorry.
Yes.
You weren't concerned on November 30th of 2021 by Mr. Crumbley's son looking at bullets or drawing guns. Is that fair?
I think there was a level of concern there, which is why we called the parents in for the meeting.
And if you recall, the level of concern was regarding the appropriateness of behavior in school.
Yes.
You didn't find his interest in guns or bullets concerning, especially in the Oxford community, if you remember.
Yes, that's correct.
You've had students draw guns on papers in the past.
Yes, that's correct.
In fact, students in Oxford, not all of them, I'm not saying all students in Oxford, but there are students in Oxford who have guns in their home.
Yes.
You know that there are students in Oxford who handle firearms.
That's a fair statement.
You would agree that it's not unusual
No, it's not unusual.
in that community.
In that community, yes.
I'm not asking you to speak about any other community, but in that community, it's not unusual for students to handle guns.
That's correct.
When faced with a situation where a student has drawn guns on papers, you typically use your education and training to assess the risk.
As far as a discipline standpoint?
Discipline or otherwise, whatever your role is in that assessment.
Yeah, so my role would be to look for any violation of our code of conduct. And so that by itself, the drawings on the worksheet, don't violate a code of our conduct.
And a violation of the code of conduct would also encompass any sort of a threat to other people. Is that fair?
That's a fair statement.
So as part of your assessment, you're also determining whether or not there's a threat.
I'm determining whether or not I need to alert somebody to something that could potentially be a threat.
And in this situation, you didn't make that alert. Is that fair?
That is correct. There wasn't any information that led me to believe there would be a reason to alert somebody else.
And part of your assessment is, again, looking at those typical early indicators that we talked about, whether there's a history of violence, correct?
That's correct.
A history of discipline.
That is correct.
Bullying behavior.
That is correct.
You look to see if there's a direct threat.
That is correct.
If those things are not apparent, if those things are not present, then it's just a student who drew a gun. Is that accurate?
That's pretty accurate, yes.
You were part of the meeting after Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived. And let me go back a little bit. So you sat in on the meeting between Mr. Hopkins and Mr. Crumbley's son, correct?
That is correct.
If you know, that meeting lasted approximately 90 minutes.
I don't remember.
Okay. You left that meeting at some point.
Yes.
Then you came back once Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived.
So I left the meeting to retrieve his belongings, the students' belongings, and returned back to the office and then left again until the parents arrived.
Okay. You entered Mr. Hopkins' office after Mr. Crumbley and his wife arrived in Mr. Hopkins' office.
That's correct.
You saw that Mr. Crumbley was seated next to his son,
Yes.
which was directly across the desk from Mr. Hopkins.
Yes.
It was your perception that Mr. Crumbley was showing care for his son,
Yes.
that he reassured his son that he can always talk to him.
Yes.
You mentioned something on direct with the prosecution about a journal,
Yes, I did.
and you seem to recall that Mr. Crumbley made reference to a journal.
He did, yes.
You don't recall Mr. Crumbley saying the one that you always keep with you?
I don't recall that, no.
He didn't say anything like the one that's in your backpack,
I don't recall.
specific colors,
I don't remember.
how long he's had it.
I don't remember.
There were no specifics about anything about a potential journal.
Not that I can recall.
So to your knowledge, you don't know if there was one journal or 15 journals. Is that fair?
I can't speak to that, no.
Right, you have no knowledge of that. Is that fair?
Yes.
After meeting with Mr. Crumbley and his wife, you felt that they were receptive of getting their son help, as was suggested by Mr. Hopkins.
Yes.
You and Shawn Hopkins did not insist that it be done that day. Now, I'm going to clarify because I know that Mr. Hopkins indicated that he preferred that it would be done that day, but neither of you said, you need to take him today and you need to go get him help right now, and if you don't, there's going to be a problem.
What Mr. Hopkins had stated was that they needed to find him some counseling as soon as possible that day, if possible.
And that he was going
would be following up within 48 hours to ensure there was something secured for the student.
And that was going to be my next question, that he was going to follow up in a couple of days, 48 hours.
Yes.
And in fact, you didn't feel in that meeting that Mr. Crumbley's son was in need of immediate care based on your education and training and perception and the knowledge that you had in that meeting.
I can't speak to that.
In no way did you feel that Mr. Crumbley was being neglectful of his son.
No, I did not.
You felt that Mr. Crumbley showed the appropriate level of emotion with his son in that meeting.
Objection is, he can't speculate as the appropriate level of emotion. He's the Dean of Students regarding code of conduct, November of 21. Speculation.
Was there anything odd about his interaction with his son?
I wouldn't say there was anything odd.
Okay.
You also didn't find it strange that Mr. Crumbley and his wife did not take their son home that day, because there was no reason for him to go home that day. Is that correct?
As far as the discipline goes, no.
During the meeting, you said that you retrieved Mr. Crumbley's son's backpack from his classroom and brought it back to Mr. Hopkins' office.
That's correct.
You indicated this backpack was heavy.
Yes, such as every other student in the school.
And let me clarify, that day, you didn't say that today. That day, November 30th of 2021, you commented to a teacher that the backpack was heavy.
Yes, I made a joke at how easily she picked it up, and then when she handed it off to me, my arm dropped down. So it was more of a joke at how strong she was compared to myself.
And if you recall, at the time, the students weren't using their lockers,
They were not using their
so it was
lockers.
fairly common for a student's backpack to be heavy.
That's correct.
You didn't look in the backpack.
I did not know.
You didn't, and I think you said you didn't have reason to look in the
I
backpack.
didn't have reasonable suspicion, no.
You didn't ask Mr. Crumbley's son to look in his backpack.
I did not know.
You did not ask Mr. Crumbley or his wife to look in the backpack.
I did not know.
You didn't look yourself or ask anyone else to look because you didn't feel that there was a reason to look in the backpack. Is that fair?
There was nothing from our conversation or from anything that we had heard so far that would indicate it was enough to reach to that level, correct?
You've had numerous discussions about this case since November 30th of 2021.
Yes.
You've talked with various attorneys.
Sure. Yeah.
And I'm not asking you about what your communications were with your own attorneys. I'm not asking about that. I'm just asking if you've met with attorneys.
I've met with many different attorneys.
You've met with the prosecutor's office?
Yes.
On more than one occasion.
Yes.
And some of those meetings with the prosecutor's office were to prepare for testimony.
Yes.
Some were to get more information about what occurred on November 30th of 2021.
One was, yes.
You learned through some of those meetings that there was no indication that there was a handgun in Mr. Crumbley's son's backpack.
Can you restate that?
Sure. You learned through some of the meetings with the prosecutor's office that there was no indication that there was a handgun in Mr. Crumbley's son's backpack while he was in Mr. Hopkins' office.
Object to the form of the question.
Yeah, what do you mean? What do you mean? Can you restate that?
Yes. I will be more clear. Do you recall testifying in September
What are you
of...
referring to, counsel?
There was testimony in September 14th of 2022 that relates to this. If you'd like, we can approach to talk about it further.
I think we should.
Okay, go ahead, Ms. Lindley.
Thank you, Your Honor. As you know, approximately 2 hours after the meeting, after this meeting with Mr. Hopkins, yourself, and Mr. Crumbley and his wife, Mr. Crumbley's son began the shooting.
Yes,
You saw the footage of the shooting.
I did, yes.
You were not aware that Mr. Crumbley's son was the shooter
Initially.
at the time.
When I saw all of the footage?
No, let me go back. So at some point early on the day of the shooting, you saw footage of the shooting.
Yes.
And that was while you were in the office of the school.
On the phone with the 911 operator?
Yes. And at that point, the thought didn't cross your mind that the shooter may be Mr. Crumbley's son.
That's a fair statement, yes.
In fact, you didn't know that it was Mr. Crumbley's son until you were told that it was him after the shooting.
I believe as the video footage continued to play when we were still on the phone, it wasn't confirmed, but I had a pretty good idea that that's who it was.
Okay. Even looking back, after you know what Mr. Crumbley's son did 2 hours after that meeting, his behaviors did not show a pattern of what he was planning to do 2 hours later.
Based on the information I knew, no.
It's fair to say that you have years of experience with at-risk students.
Yes, that's correct.
Years of experience with behavioral, academic, attendance, issues of that nature.
Yes.
You have education and training about concerning things to look for in students.
Yes.
You knew that Mr. Crumbley's son was looking at bullets on his phone on November 29th of 2021.
Yes.
You knew that he had drawn a gun and some concerning words on his math assignment.
Yeah, that's correct.
You knew that he was at the shooting range with his mom the weekend before.
Yes, that's correct.
You confirmed that during the meeting with his parents, correct?
Yes.
You knew that he had experienced significant losses in the months before November 30th of 2021.
Yes.
You knew that Mr. Hopkins was recommending that his parents have him talk to a therapist that day if possible.
That's correct.
You knew that his backpack was heavy and commented about the weight of it to a teacher.
That's correct.
You knew that firearms were not uncommon in homes in Oxford.
That's correct.
You knew that students at the high school handled firearms and that it wasn't uncommon.
We're asked and answered now, Judge.
You knew,
Yeah, he answered that.
you knew that the shooter was going to stay in school that day.
At the end of the meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Partly because he wanted to,
Yes.
and partly because his parents had to go to work.
That's what I was told, yes.
And with all of this, all of the knowledge that you had on November 30th of 2021 at approximately 10:52 a.m., you did not feel that he was a threat to anyone, and you didn't feel that you had reasonable suspicion to look in his backpack.
No, because you have to remember, I knew very little of what we all know today. So when we're looking at the big picture today, I knew a fraction of what we all know now.
And we talked about this a little bit with Mr. Hopkins as well. We all know what happened at 12:51 on November 30th of 2021. But the information that you had at 10:52 a.m. when that, or approximately 10:50 a.m. when that meeting ended, is the information that you were going on.
Yes, and that does not rise to the level of suspension or of a discipline, especially when you're considering mental health.
And it doesn't.
That supersedes any type of minor discipline or behavior violation.
So, and Mr. Hopkins talked about this a little bit. Looking in hindsight, there was more information.
Yes, we now know there's a lot more information.
You might look at things differently looking in hindsight.
I would 100% look at things differently.
But the information that you had on that day, at that time, is what led you to make the decisions that you made and feel the way that you felt about the situation that you were presented with in Mr. Hopkins' office.
That's a fair statement, yes.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Read that.
Thank you. Briefly, Mr. Ejak, let's talk about the information not shared with you at 10:52 a.m. on November the 30th, 2021. Okay, so you formed your belief that you did not have the requisite level of suspicion to search the shooter's backpack based upon what you were told. Is that right?
That is correct.
Okay. Did James Crumbley tell you that he had bought his son a 6-hour 9mm firearm 4 days before that meeting?
He did not.
Okay. Did anybody, either his son or his wife, tell you that?
No.
Did his son tell you that, or did James Crumbley tell you that his son had been begging for a 9mm handgun?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that he actually got him a different firearm in June of 2021?
No.
Did James Crumbley tell you that the details and severity of his son's friend being taken from him at the beginning of the month?
No.
Now, you indicated that as far as a discipline standpoint, your belief was that the mental health concerns would override.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
So when you have a student who is being seen for mental health, and there also are some minor violations, you know, this being a second day of insubordination, essentially, the mental health concern is what takes precedence because you want to build that relationship with the student and let them know that it's a safe space, and you don't want to follow it up with some kind of a negative interaction such as a discipline.
Is that one of the reasons why Mr. Hopkins led the meeting?
Yes.
Did your lens ever change from mental health to discipline?
It never did, no.
And is that based upon the information that you learned that day?
Yes.
Did James Crumbley ever tell you that the 6-hour 9mm handgun that he bought for his son was kept unlocked in the home?
No.
You were asked about certain indicators in your experience when you consider discipline. Is access to an unlocked firearm, is that an indicator?
Yes.
Is that something to consider, had you known that?
It would be something to consider.
Okay, but that information was not shared with you.
No, it was not.
Now, just so we're clear, sir, the information that you and Mr. Hopkins were told on November the 30th, that information wasn't shared with anybody else in administration, is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Very brief request, Your Honor. Very brief.
Okay.
Mr. Ejak, you don't know whether James Crumbley knew that his son had access to a firearm that was in the home, is that correct? You don't know whether James Crumbley knew.
So the question was he told that?
I don't know how he would know what the defendant knew.
He
Unless
testified
he was told.
what he was not told, Judge. That was the question.
Yeah, he said he wasn't told, but I don't know how he would know what your client knew unless he had a conversation about that.
Thank you. You don't know whether Mr. Crumbley's son had expressed any sadness over his friend moving to his parents, based on the information that you had on November 30th.
Can you say
Yes,
that
it was
again?
kind of a
Are you
convoluted
asking
question.
whether it was discussed in that meeting, or?
Whether Mr. Ejak knew that Mr. Crumbley's son had expressed any of this sadness that they had identified to his parents prior to that meeting. Do you know if he did?
I'm not sure what you're trying to ask. I'm sorry.
Yes. Do you know if James Crumbley was aware of this sadness that you all had identified during this meeting with Mr. Hopkins?
I do not know.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Was the information that was shared from Shawn Hopkins regarding the emails that he received?
Yes.
Okay. And he went through the drawing with James and Jennifer Crumbley?
Yes.
And at no point did James or Jennifer Crumbley ever say that the firearm purchased 4 days before mirrors the firearm drawn on that math worksheet?
They did not.
Thank you. Nothing further.
All right, you can step down and be excused. Your lunch is in here. Let's come back. This spot is wrong, obviously. If I were taller, it would have been fixed already. I'm going to ask you to return at 1 o'clock. It's not about 5 to 12. I'm going to ask you to return at 1 o'clock. In the meantime, I'm going to ask you not to discuss the case with each other or anyone else. Don't look at any news media. Don't talk to anybody. Don't Google anything. Don't do any research on your phone or anything like that. Any questions about the case now? Okay. All right, we'll see you at 1 o'clock.
All right, the jury.
Who's the next witness?
We're going to find out. I just spoke with counsel about that, and we'll let her know as soon as we know.
Okay. All right,
Thank you,
I'll
Judge.
see you at 1 o'clock.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you.